The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read. Your source for news, politics, sports, and all things trending. Here's your host, Marcus Gentry.
Republicans have three ideas about Social Security, and we call them horrible, horriblist, horribler, and horriblist. Horrible is Ron Johnson's idea that would require the government to fund Social Security every single year and let Congress vote on it. Horribler is the idea of Senator Rick Scott, which would abolish Social Security and Medicare every 5 years and start from scratch on the programs every 5 years. Lord only knows what they would look like. And horriblist is the idea that came from Leader McCarthy this week with other House Republicans saying that they would essentially crash the U.S. economy in 2023, put the economy into what they call default, have the government be unable to pay its bills unless the White House agreed to cut Social Security, cut Medicare, raise the retirement age, other kinds of cuts in this program, which the president is never going to agree to.
These Republicans, people, are trying to throw us back into the days of the robber barons. We're going to talk about the robber barons later on in the show. It's very important that we talk about that because to understand our future, we got to look at our past. And the past wasn't as glorious for us minorities as it was for white people. And the Republicans have determined to cut socialism out of this country. Now, as I'm talking about this, you're going to think that I'm some kind of way an advocate for socialism, and I'm not. You see, socialism is bad for any country if it's too much of it. But the right amount of socialism and capitalism together can make something like America. That's what makes America tick. And if they throw us back into the days of no socialism in this country, just straight capitalism, it's going to crash this country. It's going to be death everywhere, tent cities everywhere. There's going to be no middle class. It's going to be people riding around in Ferraris, BMWs, Audis, or whatever luxury car you can think of. And they're going to be riding past people living in tent cities. And I'm going to explain that later on in the show. But first, I want to go and talk about last week. I went on a rant last week because I've been kind of upset about some things for the last few months. I'm not going to rehash that, but I do want to give a story to my black socialites out there. I want to give you a story of one of my teachers. She was actually my principal. Her name was Dr. Johnson. She was the first black and first female principal at our junior high. Dr. Johnson came after Mr. Bonds left, who was sickly. I mean, he shriveled up right before our eyes. By the time he retired, he looked like a scarecrow. Miss Johnson, or doctor, I'm going to give her a title. She earned that. This is an interesting story. People like to hear my stories sometimes, but this is an interesting story. Dr. Johnson, when she came, she was a short red-boned lady with sandy red hair, cute face, but a stern face. And she would stand in the middle of the hallway every time that bell rang to make sure all of her students was in their class by the time that bell rang again. I remember I was standing in the cafeteria waiting to get my lunch, and a white kid called me a nigger. We got to fighting inside the cafeteria. Teachers rushed in, grabbed both of us, and drug us to Dr. Johnson's office. She gave us a choice: in school suspension or a paddling. Back then they used to, paddle kids. So of course, we didn't want to get our parents involved, so we both took the 5 licks. He got his first, left out the room, past me, and I bent over, got my 5 licks. And I remember balling up my fist, and I told her, "He called me a nigger." Dr. Johnson looked at me, and she said, "Marcus, I didn't give you a paddling because you defended yourself against that racist. You in school." And she gave me a funny look, and I didn't understand it at first. She said, "You understand?" She looked at me. She said, "You in school. You here to learn." It dawned on me. She couldn't tell me because she's a teacher. She's an educator. She couldn't tell me to beat up the kid. But she was telling me this is not the place for it. There's always a way to do things. About 7 years ago, this is a good story. This is for my educators out there. About 7 years ago, I've been driving trucks almost 12 years now. And about 7 years ago, I was in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was fueling up, and it had a Hardee's or a Wendy's attached to it, and I was ordering some food. Dr. Johnson walked in that building with about 6 of her sorority sisters in a whole nother state. I mean, this is a whole different state, small world. And I looked at her. She's about 69. She got to be about 70. And back then she was in her late 20s. And she still, she still kept up, she aged well. I said, "Miss Johnson?" She looked at me. She said, "Baby, do I know you?" Now, mind you, she's with her sorority sisters. And they were going to some kind of conference in Texas where all the sorority sisters from around the United States were gathering in one spot and enjoying each other and having a good time. And, I told her who my brothers and sisters were, and she kind of remembered me, but I can tell she was being polite. I don't think she really remembered me at that moment. I started to tell her sorority sister, and these women ranged from the age of 25 to 60. It varied. I think all of these girls and women lived in the same area, and they rented a van to go to the conference together. So like I said, it was about 6 to 8 of them. I told them that story, and at the end of that story, I said, "Miss Johnson used to hit harder than a kung fu action figure. She'll bring tears to your eyes with that paddle." They started laughing, and I seen it in her. She said, I remember you." She said, "Boy, you stayed in my office." And she right. I stayed in her office so much she didn't even paddle me. She would make me take out the trash and all kinds of stuff. Very, very good person. Honest to God, good person. And I remember she had a book on her desk, and I forgot the name of it. At the time, it looked like a children's book, but I didn't run across this book again until years later. And I was in a dark place. I seen the book on a book cart, grabbed it. I said, dang, Miss Johnson used to read this book. Now mind you, now this is in between the time that I was in junior high and I saw her again about 7 years ago. I mean, small world, small connections, all of this. When she left, I told her, that book you had on your desk, I want to say it was called the Peter Pan Syndrome or something like that. I think that's what it was. And she looked, she said, boy, you read that book? I said, yeah, I read that book years ago. She said, that's a good book. And I gave you this story to let you know that when I call people black socialites and I'm picking at you, I still hold you in high regard above craziness. I look at some of my black socialites in this country as black excellence, just like I look at Dr. Johnson, some of my brothers and sisters in this organization. I might talk shit, but I still hold the vast majority of you in high regard. You are black excellence. Always remember that. We have some of the greatest warriors in the world, black men and women. There's very few peoples in this world that can match us in that. You know, you had the Vikings, you had the Spartans, which is the people of Greece. You had the Mongolians, the Native Americans. But one thing that stands apart for us as black men and women is the fact that not only are we warriors, but we're educators and intelligent people. Sometimes I play the fool like I'm not. But that is a persona or a mask that I put on to make people feel at ease. Dr. Johnson came to my mind after I did that rant last week. And the reason why is because if she was around and talked to me, I know she would have gave me the best advice she can give me. Protect yourself. Protect yourself. Always protect yourself. But it's the right way to do it and the right time to do it. So I just wanted to get that message to all of my black socialites out there. You know, my people of black excellence. I treasure you. You teach our kids. And I listened to that tape, and sometimes when I get angry, my speech reverts back to ghetto southern slang and Midwest slang, and it's horrible. It's horrible. But when we get back off this break, we're going to talk about the robber barons and the Republicans' plan to snatch away all socialist programs out of this country. And what that's going to do is going to throw us into another depression. And the only people that's going to survive it are rich white people and rich black people and all other races of rich people in this country. If you're middle class, upper middle class, you're not going to survive it. It's going to wipe us out. We're basically going to have to sleep in tent cities. And I'm gonna prove it when we get back.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
The English language was much smaller in 1900. People had never heard of radios, movies, or crossword puzzles. There were no tractors, trucks, or tanks, no amplifiers, modulators, no electronics of any kind. There was no such thing as camouflage, no propaganda, no cafeterias or vaccinations. There were no chauffeurs, aviators, realtors, or hijackers. There was no income tax, no primaries, no referendums or recall votes, no city managers, no Rotary or Kiwanis. People were neither Bolshevists, modernists, fascists, nor feminists. They didn't listen to jazz or gospel or bluegrass. They had never seen a neon light. They weren't schizophrenic or psychotic. They didn't have neuroses or complexes. They didn't wear polyester or synthetics of any kind, nor sunglasses, lipstick, or bras. No one used pesticides or fluoride. Like no other time before it, the history of the 20th century can be measured out in the sheer volume of words we had to invent to describe it.
I showed that brief clip for a couple of reasons. That man named a lot of things that we didn't have, that we have today. And part of the reason why we have what we have today is because of socialism. If you notice in that clip, the vast majority of those people were white. The vast majority of the wealth in this country is white. That's not to say we blacks aren't making improvements and becoming millionaires and billionaires and thousandaires and all of that. But the controlling factor in this country right now is white. If they take away all the social programs in this country, they'll have a better control over things, because the vast majority of the money in this country is white. And that's going to throw us back into the arms of the robber barons. Let me tell you what the robber barons were. I'm gonna bring up this picture. I'm gonna bring up this picture of the robber barons. These people were the type of people. Let me bring it up real quick. Hold on. These people were the type of people who can hire 500-600 people in a county. The sheriff's wives worked there. The sheriff's nephew worked there. Everybody in that county works for that robber baron, for that millionaire who runs that plant. This was before the days of socialism in this country. The robber baron's son might get in his Ferrari and run over your child. Follow along with me for my people that's watching me on YouTube and iHeartRadio. Listen carefully. He runs over your child. The sheriff get there and tell one of his deputies to take him home. Not to jail, but take him home. Because his father runs all the jobs in this county. You get there and arrive on the scene. You want justice for your child. The sheriff tells you, well, hold on now. If he pulled the jobs out of this county, everybody around here is going to starve. You see, in steps socialism with the New Deal. I'm going to get to that later. But when socialism is put into play, he can't control everything like that. So if he can't control everything like that to where even the sheriff is scared of him, justice follows too. I'm hoping y'all following along with me. If the robber baron's hands are tied with regulations, rules, and policies that was put in place to protect the population, those rules and regulations came through socialism. If those rules and regulations are in place, it frees the sheriff hand up, because the sheriff can say, take him to jail. Not take him home, take him to jail. And if that businessman, that robber baron, pops up and says, hey, I run all the 500 jobs in this county, that sheriff can say, yeah, but it's another company over here too that runs just as many people. We don't care nothing about that. His son going to jail. Everything is a domino effect. These are the programs that the Republicans are trying to take away from us. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment, disability. If you're a wealthy black person or a wealthy white person, all of that sounds good because that's more money in your pocket. And you can become a what? Robber baron. You can control whole areas. Legally, you can control whole areas. Because once they take all of that away, all of the protections are taken away. There is no Social Security. So your grandparents, your aunt, your uncle is going to have to come stay with you because they can't stay by themselves. They don't have the money for that. It's going to throw you into poverty. If they don't have Medicare and Medicaid, you got to pay for their medicine. It's going to throw you into poverty. They take away food stamps. A lot of elderly and seniors get food stamps. That means you're going to have to pay for their food. It's going to throw you into poverty. Unemployment. If you lose your job because a company goes under, there is no unemployment. It's going to throw your family into poverty. Disability. Your leg get crushed by a machine at this man's plant, the government doesn't have to pay you nothing. That's a socialist program. That means you can't work. You got to rely on your wife, your niece, your daughter, your son to take care of you. It's going to throw you into poverty. When you look at those old black and white pictures on television and you see the granddaddy sitting on the porch with a rocking chair, his son is out in the field, his wife is hanging clothes, and you got 15 to 10 children running around in the yard. Those were the days of no socialism. Everybody had to stay in the same house. Now, we're going to get to the other side of that. You have blacks out here who wish that we would get back to that. You have whites out here that wish we would get back to that. How many of you is going to be able to stay in the house with your mother or your aunt or both of them? How many of you are going to stay in the house with your mom, your aunt, and your uncle who's in a wheelchair? That means your kids right now have separate rooms. Those kids are going to have to bunk together, and you're going to have to put your aunt and your mom in the same room Your uncle's downstairs. He can't get upstairs because he's in a wheelchair. So you got to put a bed in your living room so he can sleep in that bed in the living room. So now everybody in the household is relying on you and your wife's check. I've heard a lot of my African friends and Black American friends say that's a good thing because we can go back to farming and we can go back to this. There are millions of people in the inner cities that doesn't live in the South, that doesn't live around farmland. Those people are going to flee the cities. And guess where they're coming? They're coming to the South, and they're coming to the rural areas where there's enough space to grow food. That's going to cause total chaos because you still have gangs. You still have people that rob. You might live in Tennessee and got your little plot of land in your backyard. They don't have that in Chicago. That's the concrete jungle. So now you got some immigrant that done moved down to Tennessee from Chicago looking at your watermelons in your backyard. And as soon as you go to sleep, they gonna jump your fence and get them a couple of watermelons. It's going to be total chaos. But the only people that's going to make it are the wealthy. You know, the Kanye West and the Jay-Z's of the world. You know, the Elon Musks of the world. They're going to make it. And the reason why they're going to make it is because they can give their mom and their uncle and their aunt a pool house in the backyard. Ask yourself, how many of you can build a pool house in your backyard for your grandmother or your great aunt to stay in when they take her Social Security? They take her Medicare. She doesn't get disability. Everything I just named is a socialist program. They're trying to wipe that out. And the reason they're trying to wipe it out is because they want to get back to those days where whites had the majority rule. Because right now they still have the majority as far as money in this country. But they don't have control like they want of that money because of the socialist programs. Socialist programs put regulations on them. This is what happens to us minorities in a straight capitalist country. Pay attention.
War. There was virtually no industry in the Deep South, and construction, even of private homes, lagged far behind the rest of the country. In 1900, 9 out of every 10 African Americans still lived in the South, and 80% of them worked as sharecroppers.
Sharecropping was a lazy descent into hell, as one historian put it. African Americans found themselves in economic relations which differed in many ways very little from their experiences as slaves.
Southern sharecroppers, both black and white, rented land, seeds, equipment, homes, and sustenance from local landowners. By law, these landowners could keep their books secretly, so the tenants were never allowed to see the status of their own accounts, nor question the prices they were given for their crops. For sharecroppers, each year's crop invariably fell just short of breaking even. In the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, the Supreme Court ruled that separate facilities for black and white Americans did not violate the Constitution, so long as the facilities were of equal quality. The so-called separate but equal precedent. Whites-only signs appeared in restaurants, hotels, and bathrooms. In the South, white politicians enacted brutal legislation known as Jim Crow laws.
Let me stop that right there. Again, once they take away socialism out of this country, because see, right now, America has a love-hate relationship with socialism. You know, they've made it into a bad word for the last 40 years. Every time you turn on your TV, you hear somebody saying, we got to get rid of this socialism. I asked one of my fellow drivers who was in the room in there talking, and I asked him when he was saying we got to get rid of all these giveaways. I said, hey, what do you even know about socialism? He ain't know too much about it. I said, well, did you know socialism was Social Security? Did you know socialism was Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment, disability? You don't get disability. You crush your leg and you have to be home for 6 months. Your wife has to foot the bills. How many of your wives can foot the bill for your household if you go down? That's why they give you disability, to help supplement your household if you're hurt. You see, back in the days where they want to take us back to, those robber barons can work you 24 hours a day. You fall ill and can't work, they didn't give you nothing. You just had to go home until you recuperate. So now you don't have any money. So what you resort to? Robbing, stealing, whatever you can get your hands on. Selling scraps. Ron Johnson created a plan to dismantle all socialist programs in this country. They're trying not to expose it right now until the next elections. That's why Mitch McConnell said, no, we're not going to go with that plan. But he's lying. He's lying. You got to read between the lines. They take away these social programs, which is socialism. All the regulations that's attached to them go out the window with it. There is no middle class. Middle class is done. When your aunt that stays in Arizona loses her Social Security check and lose her house, she's going to call her nephew, which is the only family she got in New Jersey, and say, baby, I got to come up there and stay with you. I don't have any place to stay. He's not going to deny his aunt. But that's like an extra child in the house you got to take care of. So what about his uncle who might live in Tennessee? He lose his Social Security. Nephew, I need to come stay with you. It's going to wipe out the middle class. Within 1 year, we're going to have another depression. You're going to have rich, ultra rich, and then you're going to have poor and people staying in tent cities. There is no middle class. All of these houses, they will put people in them houses. I can promise you that. They're going to lower. That's one good thing that I could say might come out of this. Instead of rent being $1,600 a month for a house, the rent might drop to maybe $300 a month. That's the only good thing I can see coming out of all this. But who can still afford that? And then when you move into that house for $300 a month, you got not only your 2 kids, but your uncle, your aunt, and your mom. Those 3 can't work. They're old. They're sick. They need their medication. One might be on the oxygen mask. We're going to finish this up when we come back.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
Bring in the business.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read. The incredible series of crises with which he would deal. FDR would introduce the New Deal, a massive economic relief program designed to save the economy. This multi-pronged, complex wave of legislation was supposed to provide relief, reform, and recovery in equal measure. One central element of the New Deal was creating the Public Works Administration, which aimed to create jobs by developing various building projects. Under Roosevelt's administration, bridges, airports, schools, and other buildings were constructed across the country. The government even went so far as to pay writers and artists to produce works of art. Roosevelt would also act fast to save farmers, many of whom were now completely ruined. In the South, the plight of agricultural workers was made worse by the Dust Bowl, caused by a wave of drought and high winds. The terrible problems faced by farm laborers are one of the Grapes of Wrath's principal themes, one of the great books to come out of the Depression era. Although FDR would introduce much important legislation, his measures were controversial. Roosevelt's first New Deal in the early 30s resulted in a showdown with the Supreme Court, which tried to reverse his policies. The AAA, or Agricultural Adjustment Act, aimed to help farmers recover from difficult economic conditions, and the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, were both declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The second phase of the New Deal, from 1935 to 36, introduced the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act, which have both been long-lasting and have endured the test of time. The Wagner Act gave workers more rights, including the right to unionize. The Social Security Act gave unemployment insurance to Americans for the first time and provided for the poor, the elderly, and the disabled.
Everything you saw there is socialism. Everything. Everything. You got to ask yourself, why are these people trying to take socialism? I'm going to show you why. Ron Johnson, the man who's behind this. And I'm going to give you out his phone number too. For all these people who live in Wisconsin, call him, blow his phone up. Tell him you don't want this. The man was worth $39 million in 2018. He's worth $64 million right now. $64 million. He can survive this. He's creating bills to wipe out socialism in this country. Bills that he know he can survive, him and his family. He's worth $64 million. So if his mom, if she's still alive, was to lose her Social Security, he can just build her a house out in the backyard, complete with the stove, bedroom, toiletries, her den. He probably has several houses around the country that he can put one of his aunts in who loses her Social Security. This is going to be a hot mess. I wonder, has any of y'all thought about this? I mean, think about that. As soon as you lose that socialism out of this country, it's gone. You're going to have a flood of people living in one house, packed in. Everybody relying on the healthiest in the house to take care of everybody else. And then the robber barons come back. When the robber barons come back, it's going to be a problem. I'm going to post a link to in the description below to Ron Johnson's office and all my people in Wisconsin, call him. Blow his phone up. Tell him you don't want this. Tell him you don't want it. Tell him to sit down somewhere. Just don't threaten him. I don't want to see y'all go to jail. I don't even see how Wisconsin elected this guy. I lived up there. Racine, I just can't see it. I can't see Milwaukee electing this guy. It's got to be the people out in the rural parts of Wisconsin. But I'm gonna put his phone number in the description below. Call him. Call his office. Tell him to shit whatever ideas he have down about taking Social Security. This is the Daily Read, and I'm out.
The business, motherfucker.
The Daily Read.
Business.